There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from failure, but from the slow unraveling of everything you believed was permanent. It does not announce itself with a crash. It arrives quietly over years, dismantling the architecture of a life piece by piece, until one morning you look around and realize that the world you carefully built no longer resembles anything you recognize. For Colin Firth, one of the most respected and admired actors of his generation, that unraveling did not happen on a film set or at an award ceremony. It happened in the most private corners of his life, behind closed doors, away from cameras, in the silence between the headlines. At 65 years old, Colin Firth stands as a man who has survived things that his public image was never supposed to contain. Betrayal, public humiliation, the collapse of a marriage that lasted more than 2 decades, the quiet erosion of an industry that once placed him at its center, and the deeply painful process of rebuilding an identity when the foundations you trusted most turn out to have been crumbling beneath your feet for years. His is not a story of dramatic disgrace. There are no addiction confessions, no courtroom battles broadcast across tabloid front pages, no midnight meltdowns captured on someone's phone camera. His tragedy is quieter than that, and in many ways, that makes it more devastating. Because the world kept moving, kept applauding, kept expecting the composed and dignified Colin Firth to appear on cue, while the man himself was quietly falling apart inside a life that had stopped making sense. To understand what Colin Firth lost, you first have to understand what he built and why he built it the way he did. Colin Andrew Firth was born on September 10, 1960, in Grayshot, Hampshire, in the south of England. He was the first child of David Firth, a history lecturer and academic, and Shirley Jean Firth, a scholar of comparative religion. The household he grew up in was one of intellect, discipline, and quiet seriousness. Books line the walls. Conversations at the dinner table revolve around ideas, historical events, religious philosophy, and political thought. Emotion, in the traditional expressive sense, was not something that dominated the atmosphere of that home. What was valued was composure, thoughtfulness, and the ability to articulate ideas rather than feelings. For a boy who felt things deeply and instinctively, this environment was both formative and subtly isolating. Colin was, by most accounts, a sensitive child. He absorbed the world around him with an intensity that he had few tools to express. That gap between feeling and expression became one of the defining tensions of his inner life, and it is a tension that anyone who has watched him perform will instantly recognize. Because what made Colin Firth extraordinary as an actor was precisely that quality. The ability to hold enormous amounts of emotion just beneath the surface, to communicate interior worlds without ever allowing them to spill messily into the open. He did not perform feelings. He contained them, and in that containment created something that audiences found almost hypnotic. His family moved considerably during his childhood. They spent time in Nigeria and the United States, where his father held academic positions before returning to England. That experience of dislocation, of being the new boy in unfamiliar places, shaped him further. He became observant, adaptive, careful about how he presented himself in new environments. He learned to read rooms before he entered them. He learned that the safest way to move through an uncertain world was with a kind of measured grace that invited respect without requiring vulnerability. Drama school was not an immediate triumph. He studied at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, known as LAMDA, and his early years in the profession were marked by more rejection than recognition. Auditions that went nowhere. Parts that were promised and then redirected. The long, grinding uncertainty that characterizes the beginning of any serious acting career. But the directors and casting professionals who did notice him consistently identified something unusual. There was a stillness in him that the camera loved. A quality of authentic restraint that most young actors spend decades trying to manufacture. His early career progressed steadily, if not explosively. Television work, stage productions, and smaller film roles built his craft and his reputation. But it was in 1995 when he was cast as Fitzwilliam Darcy in the BBC's landmark adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice that everything changed. The performance was a cultural phenomenon in a way that is now almost impossible to fully convey. Britain essentially stopped on Sunday evenings to watch Colin Firth embody a character who represented a very specific and deeply appealing fantasy. A man of moral seriousness, emotional depth, and almost painful restraint, who loved truly and waited patiently and ultimately proved himself worthy of the woman he adored. The irony is profound in retrospect. The role that made Colin Firth a household name was built on a romantic ideal that his own life would eventually expose as heartbreakingly fragile. Darcy waited. Darcy endured. Darcy proved himself through loyalty and quiet devotion. And Colin Firth, the man who made that character immortal, turned out to have organized his own emotional life around precisely those same values, with consequences that no Austen novel ever prepared him for. In 1996, Colin Firth was working on Nostromo, a television adaptation of Joseph Conrad's novel, filmed in part in Italy. It was on that production that he met Livia Gigioli. She was working in a production capacity, passionate, articulate, and deeply engaged with the world in ways that complemented and challenged him. She was Italian, fiery where he was measured, outspoken where he was considered, politically engaged in an activist sense that went beyond dinner-table debate. Where Colin had learned to contain, Livia expressed. Where he moved carefully, she moved boldly. They married in 1997. It was, by all external appearances, an exceptionally well-matched union. Two intelligent, serious-minded people who had built their lives around culture, craft, and meaning. They settled into a life that was divided between London and Umbria, the ancient and impossibly beautiful region of central Italy where Livia's family had roots. Their Umbrian property became something of a personal project, transformed over years into a working farm that reflected Livia's growing commitment to sustainable living and environmental responsibility. They had two sons together, Luca and Matteo. Colin also had an older son, William, from his earlier relationship with Canadian actress Meg Tilly, whom he had met during the filming of Valmont in the late 1980s. Family was clearly important to him, and he embraced fatherhood with the same quiet seriousness he brought to most things. Friends and colleagues who knew the family during those early years consistently describe a home that felt grounded and genuine. There was no performance of celebrity domesticity. Colin and Livia were not a couple who cultivated their image as a family unit. They simply were one. Livia launched her environmental fashion platform EcoAge in the mid-2000s, and Colin supported her fully, both financially and publicly. He spoke warmly and admiringly of her work in interviews. He attended sustainability events at her request. He connected his own public profile to causes she championed. For a man who was notoriously private, whose default mode in interviews was to deflect personal questions with self-deprecating humor, this was meaningful. He was willing to be publicly associated with her passions in a way that went beyond courtesy. It was advocacy. It was devotion made visible. On red carpets, they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that stood in sharp contrast to the performance many celebrity couples engage in. They did not overtouch or oversmile. They did not manufacture chemistry for photographers. They looked like two people who had chosen each other thoughtfully and continued to choose each other with the same thoughtfulness. That was the image. And for a long time, it seems to have been more or less accurate. But marriages are not images. They are daily negotiations between two full and complicated human beings, and the gap between the external presentation and the internal reality can widen slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the two bear no resemblance to each other at all. What was happening inside the Firth marriage, beneath the Umbrian sunsets and the award season appearances and the sustainability campaigns, remained largely invisible to the world. It would not stay invisible forever. In 2017, a story emerged that forced the private world of Colin Firth into public view in the most painful possible way. Livia Firth publicly revealed that she had had an affair with Italian journalist Marco Brancaccia during a period when she and Colin had been privately separated. The separation, it emerged, had not been publicly disclosed. The couple had stepped back from their marriage quietly, without announcement, while continuing to present a united front to the world. During that period, Livia had become involved with Brancaccia, a journalist she had known professionally. The affair had ended, and she and Colin had reconciled. They had returned to their marriage, resumed their shared life, and attempted to rebuild what had broken. Then, she claimed, Brancaccia began harassing her. Persistent contact, unwanted communication, behavior that she described as stalking. Colin, when told, stood by his wife completely. He was publicly named in statements connected to the legal proceedings. The narrative that took shape in the British press was straightforward and sympathetic. A devoted husband defending his wife against harassment from a man who could not accept that a relationship was over. It was a compelling narrative. It was also, as it turned out, considerably more complicated than that. As further reporting emerged, the picture shifted. Messages and communications became part of the story. The relationship between Livia and Brancaccia, it became increasingly clear, had been more complex and more mutual in its later stages than the initial framing had suggested. The neat story of an aggressor and a victim began to develop ambiguities that neither side could fully resolve. The case was eventually settled out of court, which meant that no definitive legal verdict was ever rendered, and no single clean version of events was ever established as authoritative. For Colin Firth, the damage was of a particularly cruel kind. He had acted with complete loyalty. He had believed what his wife told him. He had put his name, his reputation, and his carefully protected public image behind a narrative that turned out to be far messier than he had understood. He had defended her publicly, and in doing so had attached himself to a story that became progressively harder to defend as more details surfaced. He had done what devoted husbands do. He had trusted, and that trust had exposed him in ways he could not have anticipated or controlled. The humiliation was not the theatrical, instantaneous kind that generates a single devastating headline and then fades. It was slow and corrosive. It came in waves, each new piece of reporting adding another layer of complexity, another set of unanswered questions, another opportunity for commentators and columnists to speculate about what Colin Firth had known, when he had known it, and what his involvement in the legal proceedings actually said about his judgment. The British press, which had spent 2 decades treating him as something close to a national institution, did not go savage. But it went quiet in a way that was its own kind of verdict. And then, in 2019, after 22 years of marriage, Colin Firth and Livia Gigioli announced their separation. There is something that those who have never experienced the end of a long marriage cannot fully understand. It is not simply the loss of a person, though that loss is real and grievous. It is the loss of a self. When you have been part of a partnership for more than 2 decades, the partnership becomes structural. It shapes your daily rhythms, your assumptions about the future, your understanding of who you are in the world. You do not have a life that exists separately from a marriage, and then a marriage on top of it. The marriage is woven through everything. Your identity, your habits, your sense of what tomorrow looks like, all of it is threaded through with the other person. When that ends, even when the ending is managed with the dignity and mutual respect that Colin and Livia publicly demonstrated, what you are left with is not simply grief. You are left with something closer to disorientation. The map of your life no longer corresponds to the territory. You know how to be Colin Firth the actor. You know how to be Colin Firth the father. But Colin Firth the husband, the partner, the man who shared a home between London and Umbria, who funded an eco-fashion empire because he believed in the person running it, who spent more than 2 decades building a life around another person's presence, that version of yourself suddenly has nowhere to live. The announcement was made in careful, considerate language. They spoke of remaining close. They emphasized their commitment to their sons. There were no public recriminations, no pointed statements designed to position either party favorably in the court of public opinion. It was handled, in the most literal sense, with class. And that handling was both admirable and, in its own way, another form of the containment that Colin Firth had practiced his entire life. The ability to endure pain without making others witness it. The commitment to composure even when composure costs everything. His sons were teenagers when the separation was finalized. The Umbrian property, which had been something close to a shared dream, a physical manifestation of the life they were building together, became an asset in a legal process. Years of shared history were sorted into the categories that divorce requires. What belongs to whom? What is divided? What cannot be divided because it lives only in memory? The London home, the Italian home, the years of photographs and shared milestones and private jokes, and the particular knowledge that comes only from 2 decades of daily proximity to another person. All of it subject to the brutal practicalities of ending. And then came the pandemic. The timing of Colin Firth's personal collapse was in some ways profoundly cruel. The divorce was finalized as the world entered a period of mandatory stillness. Lockdown stripped away the mechanisms through which busy, productive people avoid sitting with difficult feelings. There were no press tours, no script readings in rooms full of people, no red carpet appearances that require you to be switched on and presentable and performing the version of yourself that the public expects. No transatlantic flights, no sets, no colleagues, just the particular silence of a man alone in a London house with more time to think than he had perhaps ever had in his adult life. For someone like Colin Firth, whose career had provided both purpose and distraction for decades, and whose natural inclination was to process difficulty privately, and then return to the world as though the difficulty had not occurred, the pandemic offered no such option. The world had paused. The professional machinery that normally kept him occupied had ground to a halt. And in that enforced stillness, all the questions he might otherwise have deferred demanded attention. Reports from people close to him during this period indicate that he engaged seriously with therapy. Not as a public relations strategy, not as something to mention in an interview to demonstrate vulnerability, but as a genuine attempt to understand how his life had arrived at the place it had arrived at. That is a brave thing for a man raised in the tradition of British emotional restraint, educated to value intellect over feeling, and famous for the very quality of not making his interior world visible. Sitting in a room with a professional and asking honest questions about the patterns of your own life requires a kind of courage that has nothing to do with the courage of performing on screen. The questions therapy tends to generate are uncomfortable ones. Had he seen things he chose not to see? Had his commitment to keeping the peace become a form of self-abandonment? Had devotion, stretched over years without adequate reciprocity, quietly hollowed him out? Had the very quality that made him beloved on screen, that capacity for patient, contained, enduring love, become a trap in his personal life? These are not questions with clean answers. They are questions that require you to sit in discomfort for extended periods, resisting the urge to resolve them prematurely. What is clear from the evidence of his behavior during this period is that he did not crack publicly. He did not make statements he would later regret. He did not grant an interview to a sympathetic journalist in which he carefully positioned himself as the wrong party. He appeared when appearances were possible, with the same measured composure that had always defined him. He answered questions about his work. He deflected personal inquiries with the self-deprecating humor that had always served as his shield. He continued from the outside to look entirely like himself, which is both admirable and quietly heartbreaking. Because continuing to look like yourself when you are not at all sure who that self is anymore is an extraordinary act of sustained performance. And Colin Firth, whatever else could be said of this period in his life, never stopped performing his own